Joining us now in studio, Bruce Alexander. He is Professor Emeritus at Simon Fraser University in the Department of Psychology and the author of The Globalization of Addiction, a Study in Poverty of the Spirit. Nice to have you here in Upper Canada.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm glad to be here.
Tell me, what got you so passionate about this issue in the first place?
Oh, a million years ago, when I was a young psychologist, I found myself in the downtown east side of Vancouver and working amongst very hard-pressed people, heroin addicts, and it was all new to me. It came from nowhere in my life, and they really changed my life. They taught me so much.
So this has been your life's work for
40
years.
No, sorry, 40 years.
40 years. How are addiction and mental health related?
They're similar in the sense that they're all an expression of something wrong with society. I mean, we have big mental health problems and big addiction problems, and we know something's wrong. We don't know exactly what's wrong. They're different in the sense that we're moving in mental health effectively by medicalizing things. For example, the classic example is epilepsy. We used to think epileptics were possessed by the devil. Now we know they have a brain problem, and really that takes care of the problem in a very good way. Addiction's a little simpler. It has to go through a little different. It has to go through a three-stage process. We used to think that addicts were essentially possessed by the devil, just bad people. And then we thought, well, you know, we can medicalize it, it's a brain problem, but that hasn't worked out exactly as well as we thought it would. And now we have to move on to a third step, which is that addiction is really a social problem, and it must be understood on yet another level. Now, medicalizing it did us a lot of good because it gets us away from the stereotyping, and it gets us away from the blame and the shame that corrupted the earlier way of responding to addicts. But medicalizing it hasn't got us where we need to be, so we have to go to another step.
Okay, let me follow up on that then. My hunch is we're getting to the stage in society now where we are having a greater recognition of the fact that if somebody's suffering from mental health issues, it's not because they have a weakness of character or something like that. It's because something's going on medically inside their head. Are we there with addiction yet?
We're there and beyond. 30 years ago, more than that, 50 years ago, Canada got into medical treatment of addiction in a big way. I don't know if you know, the Matsqui Institution, which is a huge jail in the Fraser Valley, was built specifically to treat heroin addicts. That's why it was there. And we've done a lot of medical treatment of heroin addicts, and of course it helps. I mean, I'm in the treatment business. I'm totally for it. It helps. It's a good thing, but it's not enough. Our addiction problem continues to grow, and it continues to spread. So our problem is not that we haven't medicalized it enough. Our problem really is we've forgotten our history.
So why are so many people dangerously addicted to things that are not good for them?
Well, I have to say first that you have to realize that people are dangerously addicted to all kinds of things. It isn't just drugs and alcohol. It's sex, it's gambling, it's the internet, it's 1,000 things. And drugs and alcohol are a part of that, but not the majority.
Well, let's cut it in half then. You can be dangerously addicted, as I am, to loving the Toronto Maple Leafs, or you can be dangerously addicted to heroin. My addiction's not going to see me ending up in the gutter some night and having my life fall apart, I don't think. But being addicted to heroin could do that to you, right?
I'm sure you're not going to wind up in the gutter, Steve. And there are lots of people who are just in a minor way addicted to sports. You may not even be that. You may just love the Maple Leafs like I love the Canucks. That's possible.
Sorry about that.
It's too late now. But there are minor addictions to sports. They're not going to hurt anybody. But think about people who are majorly addicted to sports. Think about people who have gone on fighting or playing long beyond the time when they were able. They can't give it up. They keep going on, trying to reclaim that glory, and eventually they do great harm to themselves. They can even kill themselves. So there are serious addictions to sports. There are serious addictions to lots and lots of things, and there's a part of the history we've forgotten, you see. We think, oh no, only addiction is really serious, but I mean, just go back a few centuries. Our ancestors all knew that there are serious addictions to all kinds of things, and somehow we forgot it in our frenzy to deal with drugs and alcohol.
Let me read an excerpt here from your book, The Globalization of Addiction. It goes like this. Global society is drowning in addiction to drug use and 1,000 other habits. This is because people around the world, rich and poor alike, are being torn from the close ties to family, culture, and traditional spirituality that constituted the normal fabric of life in pre-modern times. This kind of global society subjects people to unrelenting pressures towards individualism and competition, dislocating them from social life. Now, this is interesting because it suggests that society's got a big role in this addiction. It's not just a chemical thing or something going on in your brain or a need for a fix of tobacco or something. There's more to it than that.
That's right. We have to go beyond the brain, really, to understand addiction. We have to go into the fact that it's a consequence of certain kinds of societies, not all kinds of societies.
But Western consumer-oriented, individualistic societies.
Actually, ours turns out to be a society which, for all its benefits and all the things we love that it produces, it has a big side effect. And one of the side effects is addiction. Another, I would say, is depression. And we have to deal with that. We can't deal with it by medicalizing it. That is, we can invent new kinds of treatment. We can do all kinds of things. We have all kinds of solutions that we're familiar with. They are not going to solve it for us. We have to look at the social cause, and we have to remedy the social cause. It's not easy.
So is that to say that I'm just going to pull something out of thin air here, and a more Eastern-oriented culture that had a more Zen-like state as part of its foundation wouldn't suffer from these kind of addictive tendencies?
No, I don't think so.
You don't want to go there.
I mean, the kind of industrialization, the kind of sort of hyper-capitalism that we're suffering from now is Eastern and Western. It's global. We're not going to get out of this by meditating. We're going to get out of it by really looking at what society does to people and remedying it. And when I start saying this, people get nervous and they think, well, I'm saying, well, we've got to get rid of capitalism and go to communism. But no, the Cold War is over. What we're talking about here is a way of taking capitalism as an established life form that we live in and we live within, and domesticating it so that it doesn't do so much harm to our children.
I don't want to read too much between the lines here, but are you making a link between addiction and our free market system?
Well, you wouldn't be reading between the lines. That's what I think it is. Yeah, I think
that's. Listen, I don't have to tell you. Some people are going to think you're pushing it with that, right? They're going to say you're suggesting a link that they will say doesn't really exist. How can you prove that?
Well, it's easy to prove it. Now, I can't prove it in a short interview, but let me give you a simple example that every Canadian knows. We had in this country pretty much a addiction-free culture, and that was the native culture prior to colonization. Now, these native people were not noble savages. They had all kinds of problems. They had war, they had slavery, they had murder, they had torture. They had torture. They had all kinds of problems. They didn't have addiction. As far as we can tell. I mean,
so they didn't have it because
they didn't have a particular kind of society which we have since imposed upon them, and in imposing it upon them, we have created just horrible, horrible addiction problems. And everywhere I go, like in British Columbia, we have societies, native societies, which are recovering, not individually so much as societies. They're just trying to put together a new way of life that fits within the free market structure and still enables their children to grow up and be healthy.
Okay, you mentioned your native British Columbia, so let me do another quote from the book. Based in Vancouver, which you say Vancouver provides an excellent case study of the spread of addiction on a globalizing planet. Despite its beauty, civility, and prosperity, Vancouver soon became known as a city with the biggest drug addiction problem in Canada. And Canada, peaceable and tidy as it is, has a world-class drug addiction problem. The United Nations Population Fund recently chose Vancouver as its example to prove that the social problem of the 21st century urbanization strike rich cities as well as poor cities in the third world. Now, why would a place that so many people think is one of the nicest, sweetest places in this country to live, racially harmonious and Okay, you had an off night on Game 7, but you know, the rest of the time,
Thank you.
Why
That's all it was.
why would so many people be living with addictions in Vancouver?
Because it's Terminal City. Vancouver.
It's what?
It's Terminal City. That's a nickname for Vancouver.
Oh.
It's where people come to when they've been in Europe, they've been in Asia, they've been in other places in North America, and they wind up in Vancouver because they're still seeking sort of the last frontier. It's where people come to and leave their families behind. It's a city where a tremendously high proportion of the population were not born there. They don't have the stable extended families that they do in other places. They don't have the stable traditions because Vancouver, God bless it, is a wonderful mixture of every kind of ethnic tradition. Well, and that mixture is great. It makes life wonderful, but it's also dislocating in the sense that people really don't have the kind of stability, the kind of certainties that they do in other places. So Vancouver, in spite of all its blessings, is in fact the most addicted city in Canada, as far as we can measure that.
I was being a bit facetious earlier, but maybe I was onto something here with this suggestion of the Game 7 violence. Was there a bit, 100,000 people in the streets, was there some kind of, I don't know, addiction among some of the people out there that they were just addicted to the violence of the moment?
Well,
You want to go there?
Sure, I want to go there. First of all, I have to correct something, which is that the number of people who were actively rioting was very small.
Right.
There are a lot of people in the streets, but the number of people actively rioting was very small. Now, were they addicted? Well, they could have been. I don't know any of those people. I can't even comment on that. But but it's likely. It's possible some of them were addicted to thrill seeking or something like that. The bigger problem, I think, is the fact that this story goes on and on. As you said, it was just a bad night in the city. That's right. That's all it was. It was a small problem. But for days afterwards, there was nothing on the radio. There was nothing in the newspapers except this on and on story. Mm-hmm. Now, to me, that's more of an addiction story.
Interesting.
I call it the season ticket holders for the media circus. There are people who just want to follow the media circus and the fact that it was a relatively small problem and a problem that we know how to correct. Most people should be punished, of course they will be. But the people who sort of live in the media, those kinds of thrill seekers, that's a larger number of people, and in a sense, I think that could be a larger addiction problem. Now, incidentally, let me ask you a question, if I'm allowed. I know
Sure.
it's your agenda here, but
Okay.
what do you think is the most dangerous addiction that we face?
Are you saying related to the violence in the streets that day? Or just
No, just in general.
drugs and alcohol? That'd be the first thing popping into my head.
Well, the first thing that pops into most people's head, because I ask that question all over the place, is money.
Addicted to making money or spending it or whatever?
Money.
Something related to money.
Well, something related to money. And if that's the case, then you see we have to understand addiction in a whole different way. We have to shift our paradigm. Now, I could argue, if I had a little more time, I could show you why it makes a lot of sense to say that addiction to money is the most dangerous addiction.
Go ahead, fire away.
But think about it in terms of the infamous CEOs of Goldman Sachs and all these other terrible, predacious, predator kind of investment banks. What are those guys like? Well, in many cases, their life is pretty well known. Not in all cases, but in many cases, their life is pretty well known. These guys really are severely addicted to money.
Yeah.
They say it themselves. They cheat their grandmother to
make a buck.
Yeah. Well, now think about the kind of harm those guys do. You could look down on the street, I guess, from their office towers, and you could see there'd be junkies down there, maybe robbing people or stealing cars or whatever. But look up on those towers, and you see guys who are controlling private armies that are raping the environment,
But there's a small handful of those guys.
Small handful with a lot of employees and a
Who
lot
follow
of
that kind of
and enormous power. The kind of power that enables them to take over governments in the third world at least, and we don't just know how much influence they have on the governments here. Now, I'm not asking you to believe all that in a 2-second presentation, but what I'm saying is, We've got to think about addiction in a much broader sense, or we miss it. We miss the whole problem. We say, oh, there are these junkies down on the street, and they're doing harm to us. It's true, they are doing harm to us, and we need to worry about that. But there's a larger issue, and that larger issue is the one we've missed. That's why, in the case of addiction, we have to go beyond, the old stigmatization. We have to go, and we also have to go beyond the medical model. We have to go into a much larger social analysis, and that's what I think is happening.
So if we're going beyond the traditional drugs, alcohol, tobacco, that kind of thing, into something as potentially broad as money, is there any cure for this?
Sure. People weren't always likely to grow up and become predacious billionaires or addicted to the internet or addicted to sex or addicted to drugs or addicted to prescription drugs or anything else. That wasn't always the case. There are some kinds of societies in which that happens. Unfortunately, we're one. That's a side effect of the particular kind of society that we live in. We have to change it. It's not like Bruce Alexander is going to go out and change society because he sees it's bad for addiction. It's rather that we are in a period of very rapid social change, catastrophic social change. We see our institutions crumbling all around us. It's time for rebuilding. And the rebuilding, of course, is going to take into account that the old system was economically unfeasible and environmentally unfeasible. It's also really psychologically unfeasible. And we have to reconstruct it on that basis.
This is a half or full century-long project you're talking about, probably, isn't it?
I'm not talking about a Band-Aid or a quick fix.
Yeah.
I'm talking about generations. But
you think it can be done?
I mean, if you interview somebody with a book called The Globalization of Addiction, you'll have to expect a global solution. And by the way, a website called globalizationofaddiction.ca. I hope people will come and visit me because it is a global problem, and it is, as you say, it's a project of generations. I look at native villages again in BC, and they don't expect to get over their addiction problems tomorrow or next week or next year. They're talking about making progress over the generations, and I think we've culturally, Western civilization sort of backed itself into exactly that corner. It's going to take us a while to recover in some ways. Some parts of our environment may never recover, but psychologically we can recover, but we got no quick fix.
Bruce Alexander, Professor Emeritus, Simon Fraser University. You've given us a lot to think about tonight. Thanks so much for coming into TVO.
Thank you, Steve.